Hi, I'm Susan. Welcome back to Cancer Research Demystified. Today we're going to try to answer the almost impossible question of what is the single greatest challenge in cancer research today? Welcome back to our channel. Firstly, I just want to say, sadly, of course, there's still no Hayley here because I am filming from home. I still haven't been back to the lab yet. It's December 2020 and I'm still working at home as I have been since March. I've replaced Hayley, as I thought she would deem appropriate, with a plant. We're both big fans of plants, so this can be our Hayley for the moment. And later on in the video, we're going to virtually pop over to Hayley's house where she will weigh in on this question as well. So, over the last month or so, I've been asking this same question across the internet, different social media platforms, and different websites, and seeing what you think is the single greatest challenge in cancer research today. Naturally, there has not been a clear consensus. This is something that we all have our own take on. I think if I were to try and draw a consensus from all of the answers that we've gotten from all of you, it would probably be that it's complicated and that there are a lot of interwoven challenges. And I suppose this makes sense. You know, if there wasn't so many challenges in cancer research, then we would have figured it all out already. But we haven't. And so today I'm going to take you through an overview of what all of you answered as some of the key challenges, an overview of what some of the main funding bodies deem to be the big challenges, and I will attempt at the end, after popping over to Hayley, to come back and give you a summary of what I think personally is the single greatest challenge. It's a hard question, but I don't want to leave this video without at least attempting to actually give one single answer myself. So broadly speaking, the answers that we received across the internet from all of you did fall roughly into two categories. One was biology and the other was barriers. So in other words, the challenge around the biology of the cancer itself and the challenge of actually trying to do the research and make it translate. Within the biological side of things, one of the topics that came up a few times was drug resistance. This one's close to my heart as it's what I did my PhD on. So it was nice to see that other people share that concern that drug resistance is really something that we do need to be working on, something that provides a really significant challenge for clinicians, scientists, and other researchers around the world trying to figure out how to treat patients in a way that their tumor doesn't become resistant to the treatment that we're giving it. There was a particularly poignant comment from one of our responders who said, "As soon as you think it's under control, oh, here we go again." Another very common theme on the side of biological challenges was the heterogeneity that we see within tumors and between tumors. When I say heterogeneity, I'm talking about the genetic landscape of the tumor, the way the biology behaves within each tumor cell. We know as researchers now that this does really vary within a tumor itself, and that makes it extremely hard for us to study and understand. This presents challenges not only for our research, but particularly for how we can actually treat the tumor when it's so changeable and adaptable and so different from patient to patient, as well as literally within a tumor itself. And that biological complexity really poses quite a tantalizing challenge for researchers like us, who quite enjoy trying to sort of play chess with a tumor and figure out exactly what it's thinking in biological terms. The third challenge on the side of biological challenges that came up a few times was around insufficient models for cancer research. This is one that's particularly close to my heart. I think that a lot of the cell lines and animal models that we're using today really just don't translate well into the clinic. We study huge amounts of experiments, we do projects, we build up huge potential lists of drugs that could one day make it to the clinic. But we research them all in these models that really don't represent the human environment that well. And a huge proportion of these just don't end up translating into the clinic. This poses a particular challenge with regard to immuno-oncology. This is an area of really exciting momentum at the moment, where we're adapting the human immune system to actually fight our tumors for us. These are some really, really exciting treatments that have started to become available in recent years. But to research the human immune system in a cell, in a dish, in the lab, or indeed in a mouse, that doesn't really apply very well. The immune system is very complex, and it really requires a better model than the ones that we're typically using in order to figure out how these treatments work and whether other treatments are being affected by the immune response. Tumor models are getting better and better, and there are emerging human tissue models that we can use that can be quite useful in some spaces. They're still relatively limited with regard to immuno-oncology, and some mouse models are getting better at modeling the immune environment, but we're really not there yet. And so I have to say, this is one of the challenges that I most agree with that we really, really need to focus on and improve. Now, quite a lot of the comments that we received across the internet were not really related to biological challenges within cancer research. They were much closer to the barriers that prevent us from doing our research to the best of our ability. We've all these great ideas and great things that we want to do, but sometimes there are things that just get in our way across the system. The first of these that got by far the most comments of any challenge was funding. This came up again and again. I suppose when cancer researchers think of the challenges within our own careers, naturally, the thing that is the hardest to get is funding. You may not realize as a cancer patient or a loved one of a cancer patient that actually researchers spend a pretty high proportion of our time writing and applying for funding. It's sort of a bit like Dragon's Den, but usually in a written document. There can be interviews as well, but it's a long process, and it's us trying to convince funding bodies like charities, governments, universities, philanthropists, pharma companies, whoever it might be, to actually sponsor our research and give us the financing that we need to carry it out. This science is really, really expensive, and it takes a lot of our time to apply for this funding. And as you can imagine, as with any competition in life, a lot of the time that we apply, we get rejected. It's not surprising to me that many cancer researchers automatically quickly answer funding as the single greatest challenge for them in doing their cancer research. There were a lot of other points that were made around barriers to cancer research on that sort of systems level, and a few people used the word cooperation to explain this. And I actually think that's a pretty nice summary of some of the other points that were being made here as well. Now, this cooperation can be between researchers in different countries who are working on the same thing and maybe could be cooperating and collaborating a bit closer than we are. It could be on a larger scale between hospitals and pharma companies to make sure that trials are available to more patients. I saw some patients saying that these trials should be made available across the world, but they're often maybe more available in the United States. And I think this probably applies across some other countries as well. A few researchers referred to this as red tape and said that there's constant kind of paperwork barriers around trying to actually start our research, where we have to jump through a lot of hoops and cooperate with a lot of different organizations, teams, and a lot of forums before we can actually get the research started. So while this isn't a grand challenge that we can think to overcome as scientists, it's worth bearing in mind because this is a genuine challenge that researchers are facing. Maybe we could be working more efficiently together on a global scale in a way to actually fight these grand biological challenges. Finally, last but not least, on the side of barriers to cancer research, fantastic patient advocate Roberta Horgan, who has been very supportive of CRD, did point out one thing that I thought was really worth mentioning, and that's COVID-19. COVID-19 has really slowed down a lot of cancer research this year. A lot of trials had to suspend recruitment, and once they started again, patients weren't necessarily that willing to get involved, especially if it meant extra trips to the hospital, which is more than understandable. Researchers ourselves are often working from home like I am. I'm asthmatic, so if I have the option to work from home during a respiratory pandemic, I'm going to choose it. And that does mean I'm doing less lab work. If you're interested in seeing some of the workarounds that cancer researchers like myself did try to come up with so that we could still progress cancer research during the pandemic, then we do have another video on this, and I will link that down below. So that summarizes what our internet friends thought in terms of an answer to this very grand question. And I think it's worth taking into account who these internet friends are. So, broadly speaking, many of the people who engage with our account are cancer researchers as well. So, I think that's where a lot of the barriers to cancer research answers were coming from. But we also do engage with a lot of patients, patient advocates, and family members. And some of the answers are clearly coming from those as well. I also think we had a few answers from students. One thing that we did have a bit of a lack of answering from was funding bodies themselves, but we were very fortunate to get one response from NCRI. So, as I go on to talk about the funding body answer to this question, I'll firstly highlight the answer that NCRI gave us on Twitter, which makes it clear that they think that there's a lot more than one challenge. So, NCRI are currently focusing on a few different grand challenges with regard to their strategy at the moment, and that includes health data, AI, immunology, prevention, and early diagnosis. I would definitely agree all of these are key, and it's interesting that some of those didn't really come up in many of the responses from our internet friends. Similarly, CRUK came up with 4 particular strategic areas that they want to focus on. That's prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and the fourth I find interesting, it's optimization. They want to optimize how we treat patients. This is very in line with the area of research that I'm in, and I think it's worth mentioning because we typically tend to think of some of the key challenges around cancer being prevention, diagnosis, and treatment, but actually optimizing treatments that we've already got to make them better is a really key challenge that a lot of people are researching towards. They've also been funding something called a Grand Challenge over the last number of years, and these are really large projects with lofty goals to really try and make a huge difference in cancer research. If you're a cancer researcher, then you may have already seen that they're currently calling for expressions of interest around a large funding proposal that is due in April of 2021. And this is looking at 9 key challenges within cancer research. So, before I attempt to summarize all of that huge amount of challenges that we have just pulled together and actually come up with an answer myself on what I think is the single greatest challenge in cancer research, I did just briefly want to pop over to Hayley Pye's house and see what she thinks.
So Susan's been asking a particularly difficult question at the moment. What's the biggest challenge in cancer research at the moment? And it's a difficult question, but if I was to answer it, I would say the biggest challenge for me is like knowing what we know about cancer, knowing all the science, understanding it so much better than we ever have, but not seeing that necessarily translated clinically, seeing people coming into the clinic with a new diagnosis and being offered the same things that they were offered 20 years ago. And I think getting to that point where we can truly use what we know about the personal nature of everyone's cancer and how it reacts with their own body, how we can translate that into tests that we can do and link it to treatments and prognosis in the clinic. Like that's a big challenge at the moment, but we are getting there and it's an exciting area to work in.
So, these are some great points from Hayley, and they actually, without us talking about it, led quite nicely into what I was going to attempt to summarize as my take on the single greatest challenge in cancer research. And that actually comes back to a challenge that some of you raised as well, and it's insufficient models around cancer research. This is an area I'm biased in. It's something that I'm researching myself and trying to improve on. So, a big caveat that this is already the problem that I've chosen to address in my career. Now, to be honest, that has to be my answer. If I thought something else was the greatest challenge in cancer research, then why would I be researching that? So I'll take a minute to go into a bit more depth on what I'm talking about with cancer models. So currently, when we're investigating a new diagnostic or a new treatment for cancer, We typically look at cells in dishes in the lab, and we have some videos that we can show you where we actually talk about those cells, how they work, and how we keep them alive in the lab environment. As well as using cells in dishes, we would often use animal models. This would probably most commonly be mice, where we actually inject cancer cells into the flank of a mouse or somewhere else and actually see how the mouse deals with that cancer. We can then treat the mouse with a drug if we're trying to develop a drug. Now, neither of these things, the cells in dishes or the mice in cages, accurately represent a patient in the hospital. I'm sure you can figure that out yourself, even if you don't have any background in biology. A human and a mouse are very, very different, and a human and a cell in a plastic dish are even more different. And with this in mind, it's probably not a huge surprise that 96% of preclinical studies do not translate to the clinic. So, as Haley said, this translation of all the hard work we're doing in the lab, all of this research, it just doesn't necessarily happen. It doesn't necessarily get to patients. Personally, I think one of the main reasons for this huge failure rate in cancer research is the models that we're using. The vast majority of the experiments that we're doing are in one of these two things, either cells in a dish or a mouse. And so there's been an area of rapidly expanding interest over the last few years to develop better models. One of the first things that happened was something called PDX models, where instead of putting a cell from a dish into a mouse, we actually take a tumor from a patient and put that into the mouse. So, okay, it's still a mouse, it's not a human, but the tumor inside that mouse is a human tumor. This got us one big step better and closer to accurate models. Of course, we're never going to get a 100% accurate model, short of having an actual human in the lab, which would be wildly unethical to treat someone with a drug that we didn't know if it would work yet, that we didn't have enough data on. We just can't do that. So we need to spend the next few years coming up with better and better models incrementally. And there's an awful lot going on here. Since PDX has started to come out, there's been labs all over the world finding better ways to generate new, different versions of PDXs and other mouse models that actually incorporate elements of the human immune system so that we can get closer to actually testing things with relation to how a human immune response would happen in a human. Again, it's not perfect, but it's getting a little bit closer. In terms of cells in a dish in a lab, we've been getting a little bit better there too. Our cells used to generally always be grown in a 2D layer across the base of a flask, but we've actually found ways to grow them in clumps or spheres called spheroids. We can mix different types of cells together so that we're starting to get a little bit closer to having a miniature organ in a dish in the lab, and this is typically called organoids. We've had an advance beyond that where people actually add flowing liquid across the cells to represent the human vasculature, and that added with some other elements like different types of cells can start to be called a tumor on a chip approach. And we also use just chunks of human tumors in a lab dish that we actually try and keep alive for a few days, called explant culture. Now, each of these 3D models do get us a little bit closer to seeing a human environment within the lab. But with every new idea and every new model, there's a huge amount of validation that needs to be done. And we are really not there yet with that. A lot of these models were developed in silos by different researchers around the world. And this is where some of the barriers come in that some of our researchers suggested online. We're developing a lot of these ideas separately and not really cooperating with each other. We're not independently validating each other's models, and often we're not comparing them directly to a human response. This means that there is a huge amount of work left to do in this area. It's a mammoth challenge, and I think if we were to overcome that challenge and get to a point where we had models of cancer that reliably recreate the human tumor environment, then yes, I think it would be a bright new day as the sun just comes out on me here. I think that would be a huge step forward in cancer research, something really promising. That's about it for this episode. I'm going to list a whole load of links down below in the description of the different funding bodies that I have mentioned and their takes on what key challenges are in cancer research today. I'll also link some relevant videos where we did actually talk about some of those 3D cancer models, where we talked about cells and some of the other relevant topics that were mentioned in this video. For this particular video, I want to say a huge thank you to everybody who engaged with us online. I will try and list as many Twitter handles and Instagram accounts as I can below. Please go check out these wonderful thinkers. They are from a wide variety of specialties and interests, and I'm sure that they would enjoy you telling them what you think of their take on the single greatest challenge in cancer research today. This is most likely going to be our last video of 2020, so I would wish you all happy holidays, all of the very best for the new year. And if you enjoyed this video, please do look through our playlists of some of the other topics that we've discussed. Go ahead and hit subscribe, like and share if any of your friends might be interested, and drop us a comment of what you think. What do you think is the single greatest challenge of cancer research today?